The psychic dominion had, over the course of roughly 4,000 years, managed to organize the galaxy according to what they considered the most logical principle imaginable: mental superiority. It was a beautifully simple system, really. The stronger your telepathic abilities, the higher your position in the cosmic pecking order. Think of it as social Darwinism with a psychic twist, or perhaps evolutionary theory as interpreted by beings who could literally read minds and had developed correspondingly massive egos about it. At the apex of this mental monarchy sat the Mordarchy, a species whose telepathic prowess was so refined they could perform psychic surgery on a thought while simultaneously composing epic poetry about the experience. Their crystalline neural structures had evolved over millions of years specifically for mental manipulation, making them natural-born aristocrats in a universe where brain power trumped everything else. They'd appointed themselves the galaxy's psychic police, judge and jury, a role they performed with the kind of smug efficiency that comes from never having encountered a mind they couldn't crack like a philosophical walnut. The Dominion's classification system was elegantly ruthless. Tier 1 species possessed telepathic abilities that could reshape reality itself. Naturally, these were reserved for the Mordarchy and their closest allies. Tier 2 and Tier 3 species could read minds across planetary distances and influence entire populations with a concentrated thought. Tier 4 through Tier 6 species managed various levels of local telepathy, from citywide influence down to simple mind reading within conversational distance. Then came the unfortunate masses of Tier 7 through Tier 9 species beings whose telepathic abilities ranged from barely detectable to might as well be furniture. These poor creatures were relegated to menial labor, basic service industries, and the kind of jobs that didn't require much thinking because, frankly, what was the point of having thoughts if you couldn't share them telepathically? The system worked beautifully, assuming you happened to be born with the right kind of brain chemistry. Everyone knew their place, society functioned with clockwork precision, and the Mordarchy got to feel superior about their evolutionary advantages. It was the sort of setup that made perfect sense, right up until someone came along and proved that the entire foundation was built on quicksand. Enter humanity, stage left, with their adorable little chemical rockets and their charmingly primitive understanding of basic physics. When first contact had been established 18 months ago, the Psychic Dominion's xenobiological assessment teams had taken one look at human neural architecture and promptly classified them as Tier 9 primitives, the absolute bottom of the telepathic food chain. Humans couldn't read minds, influence thoughts, or perform even the most basic psychic functions. They were, according to the official reports, telepathically inert to the point of neurological deficiency. This classification had been reached through the standard procedure of remote psychic scanning, conducted from a safe distance by junior Mordarchy technicians who were still learning the finer points of mental intrusion. The scans had revealed human brains to be chaotic, disorganized, and utterly lacking in the refined neural pathways that characterized proper telepathic development. Case closed, classification assigned, move along to the next species. What the remote scans hadn't revealed, what nobody could have predicted, was that human minds weren't just telepathically inert, they were telepathically toxic. Echo Station 7 squatted in the Kepler transit zone like a massive bureaucratic spider, its web of docking arms and processing corridors designed to handle the constant flow of species requiring official psychic classification. The station served as one of hundreds of neural purification centers scattered throughout Dominion space, facilities where newly contacted species received their official telepathic assessment and subsequent social ranking. The architecture was deliberately intimidating. Soaring crystalline spires that hummed with psychic energy, corridors lined with neural amplifiers that could boost telepathic signals across continents, and assessment chambers designed to make even the most confident beings feel like insects under a microscope. It was governmental bureaucracy elevated to an art form, with the added bonus of mind-reading capabilities to ensure nobody could lie on their psychological evaluation forms. Zyx'andra had been working the classification desk at Echo Station 7 for the better part of 3 centuries, long enough to have personally processed roughly 40,000 sentient beings from across the known galaxy. She'd seen it all: species that thought in colors, beings whose consciousness existed in mathematical equations, hive minds that required specialized equipment just to prevent feedback loops. After 300 years of mental tourism, she'd developed the kind of professional confidence that comes from never having encountered a problem she couldn't solve with the appropriate application of telepathic force. Her workstation occupied prime real estate in the station's central assessment chamber, a crystalline amphitheater designed to showcase the Mordaki's telepathic superiority. The setup was elegantly simple. Subjects entered through the lower portal, approached the scanning platform, and submitted to psychic evaluation, while dozens of junior telepaths observed from elevated gallery. It was part scientific procedure, part public demonstration, and part theater, a combination that served to remind everyone exactly who was in charge of this corner of the universe. The morning had progressed with typical efficiency. Zyx'andra had processed a family of Kethari merchants, solid tier 6, suitable for middle management positions, a delegation of Vorthak engineers, impressive tier 5, qualified for technical supervisory roles, and a rather nervous group of Plictel traders who'd turned out to be tier 7 despite their obvious attempts to enhance their telepathic signatures with illegal neural stimulants. Each assessment followed the same routine. Subject approaches platform. Zyx'andra extends her crystalline appendages to make contact with their neural cortex. Telepathic interface establishes connection. Mental architecture gets mapped and classified. Appropriate documentation gets filed. Next subject, please. It was as routine as breathing, which was probably why Zyx'andra didn't pay much attention when the next subject approached her platform. Tobias Fletcher looked about as remarkable as a glass of lukewarm water. Medium height, medium build, wearing the kind of practical expedition gear that suggested he spent more time digging through ruins than attending diplomatic functions. His identification papers marked him as a xenoarchaeologist from something called the Terran Colonial Authority, one of those quaint human organizations that seemed to multiply faster than anyone could keep track of them. Humans had been trickling through the assessment stations for months now, ever since the Dominion had opened formal diplomatic channels with Earth. They were all classified as Tier 9 primitives, of course, which meant the actual scanning process was more of a formality than a genuine evaluation. Zyx'andra could usually complete a human assessment in under 30 seconds, just long enough to confirm their telepathic deficiency and assign them to whatever menial labor category seemed most appropriate. Tobias carried a sealed containment case that his papers identified as archaeological specimens from pre-contact human civilizations. Perfectly routine. Lots of primitive species brought cultural artifacts to their classification appointments, probably hoping that evidence of ancient wisdom might bump them up a tier or two. It never worked, but Zyx'andra had learned not to crush their pathetic hopes too quickly. Better to let them maintain their dignity during the scanning process. Standard telepathic classification, she announced, her mental voice carrying the kind of bored authority that came from having delivered the same speech roughly 40,000 times. Please approach the scanning platform and remain motionless during the evaluation process. This assessment will determine your cognitive tier and subsequent social placement within the psychic dominion. Tobias nodded and stepped onto the designated markers, setting his containment case beside the platform with the careful movements of someone who'd spent years handling fragile artifacts. He looked nervous but compliant, the same expression most primitive species wore when faced with the awesome reality of Mordaki telepathic power. Zyx'andra activated her neural interface systems, feeling the familiar warm-up cycle as her crystalline cortex prepared for another routine mental invasion. Her telepathic probes extended like invisible fingers, reaching out to establish contact with yet another disappointingly primitive consciousness. 3 centuries of experience had taught her exactly what to expect from human neural architecture. Disorganized, chaotic, and utterly lacking in the sophisticated mental structures that characterized truly advanced species. She made contact with Tobias's forehead, her crystalline appendages settling against his skin with practiced precision. And then her universe exploded. The first sensation was wrongness, not pain exactly, but a fundamental violation of everything she understood about consciousness. Human minds, it turned out, weren't just disorganized, They were actively, aggressively chaotic, in ways that seemed to violate several basic principles of neurological function. Where every other species maintained some semblance of mental architecture, humans appeared to have evolved consciousness that operated on principles of controlled insanity. Zyx'andra's telepathic probe, designed to slide smoothly through organized thought patterns, crashed into Tobias's consciousness like a precision instrument meeting a hurricane. His mind wasn't just resistant to telepathic intrusion, it was lethally hostile to it. Every attempt to establish a stable mental connection triggered cascading feedback loops that sent increasingly violent psychic shockwaves back through her neural interface. It was like trying to perform brain surgery with a chainsaw while riding a roller coaster during an earthquake, in a thunderstorm, while being attacked by caffeinated hornets. But the truly horrifying part wasn't the chaos. It was the realization that this wasn't accidental. Human consciousness had evolved this way deliberately as a defense mechanism against exactly the kind of telepathic intrusion that the Mordarchi had spent millennia perfecting. Their minds weren't primitive. They were fortified. Every chaotic thought pattern, every random neural firing, every seemingly meaningless mental tangent was actually part of an incredibly sophisticated anti-telepathy defense system. And Zyx'andra had just walked face-first into it at full telepathic power. The feedback was immediate and devastating. Her crystalline neural structures, refined over millions of years for telepathic precision, began overloading in sequence as human mental chaos flooded through her consciousness. She experienced, in the span of roughly 4 seconds, what it felt like to have a human brain. The constant internal noise, the way thoughts bounced around like hyperactive ping-pong balls, the peculiar sensation of being aware that you were thinking about thinking. It was like being forced to experience consciousness from the perspective of a being whose evolution had gone catastrophically wrong, except that the more she experienced it, the more she realized it hadn't gone wrong at all. It had gone differently. Humans had evolved mental chaos as a feature, not a bug, and their apparently primitive consciousness was actually the most sophisticated anti-telepathy system she'd ever encountered. The scream that erupted from Zyx'andra's vocal apparatus was 1 part telepathic overload, 2 parts existential horror, and 3 parts the sound a master craftsman makes when their finest tool explodes in their hands. It was a scream that conveyed, in perfect psychic harmony, the message that everything the Mordarchi thought they knew about consciousness was wrong. Wrong, catastrophically wrong. The fainting that followed was really just her neural cortex's way of protecting itself from further exposure to weaponized mental chaos. Tobias watched in growing alarm as the crystalline alien, who'd been about to classify his cognitive abilities instead, produced a sound that seemed to originate from several dimensions at once, grabbed her head as if trying to prevent a telepathic hemorrhage, and then collapsed onto the scanning platform like a marionette whose puppeteer had suddenly developed a severe case of the shakes. The central assessment chamber erupted into controlled pandemonium. Emergency medical teams materialized from hidden alcoves with the kind of speed that suggested this sort of thing happened more often than the official statistics probably admitted. Other Mordarchi telepaths rushed down from the observation galleries, their crystalline faces displaying expressions that ranged from professional concern to barely concealed panic. "What happened?" demanded Administrator Vorthek, a senior Mordarchi, whose neural crown indicated he was qualified to perform telepathic surgery on entire star systems. "What did you do to Scanner Zyx'andra?" Tobias raised his hands in the universal gesture of "Please don't vaporize me with your superior alien technology." "Nothing. She was doing the mind-reading thing and then she just screamed and fell over. Is that supposed to happen?" The medical team had managed to get Zyx'andra onto a hover stretcher, though she remained unconscious, and was making occasional whimpering sounds that seemed to contain complex mathematical equations related to telepathic trauma theory. Dr. Kelnoth, the station's chief xenopsychologist, was running intensive neural scans with equipment that looked like it had been designed to peer directly into the soul. "Her telepathic centers have experienced massive overload," Dr. Kelnoth announced to the growing crowd of concerned officials. "The feedback patterns are unlike anything in our medical databases. It's as if she attempted to interface with something that was specifically designed to destroy telepathic contact. All attention focused on Tobias, who was beginning to understand that his species' classification as harmless primitives might need some revision. Administrator Vorthek approached him with the kind of caution typically reserved for unexplained explosive devices. "You're human," he stated, as if this were somehow both obvious and deeply problematic. "Guilty as charged," Tobias confirmed, though I'm starting to think that might be more significant than anyone realized. The next several hours were a masterclass in bureaucratic panic, disguised as scientific inquiry. Tobias found himself relocated to what they euphemistically called a secure consultation facility, though the energy barriers and the fact that his archaeological specimens had been confiscated suggested it was more accurately described as a very polite prison designed by beings with advanced degrees in xenopsychology. Meanwhile, every telepathic expert on Echo Station 7 was trying to figure out how a supposedly primitive species had managed to accidentally weaponize their own consciousness against the galaxy's most advanced mind readers. Zyx'andra gained consciousness after approximately 6 hours, though her first words upon awakening were, "Keep that thing away from me," followed by a detailed request for immediate reassignment to any posting that didn't involve humans, preferably in a different galaxy entirely. The medical reports described her condition as severe telepathic trauma with associated species-specific phobia, which sounded both serious and oddly specific. Dr. Kelmanoth spent the better part of 18 hours analyzing the neural feedback data, occasionally making notes and muttering things like, "Impossible," and "This changes everything," and "How did they evolve natural psychic warfare?" His findings, when finally compiled into an official report, read like a scientific paper written by someone having an existential crisis. "The issue," he explained to an emergency session of senior Mododaki administrators, "is that our entire telepathic classification system is based on the assumption that consciousness operates according to certain universal principles. We can interface with other species' minds because their mental architecture, however primitive, follows recognizable patterns." He activated a holographic display showing neural scan data that looked like someone had fed abstract expressionism into a particle accelerator. Human consciousness appears to have evolved along completely different lines. Instead of developing organized mental structures that permit telepathic interface, they've evolved what can only be described as weaponized mental chaos. "Are they deliberately hostile?" asked Administrator Vorthek, his neural crown flickering with patterns that suggested he was already calculating military implications. "That's the truly disturbing part," Dr. Kelmanoth replied. "They don't appear to be consciously aware of their anti-telepathic capabilities. Their mental chaos isn't a weapon, it's their natural state of consciousness. They've evolved brains that are naturally immune to telepathic intrusion because their thoughts are too disorganized to interface with safely." The implications were staggering. Here was a species that had been classified as the lowest tier of telepathic development, when in reality they possessed what amounted to perfect psychic defense systems. Not through technology or training or conscious effort, but simply by being too mentally chaotic for telepathic abilities to work properly. Word of the psychic immune humans spread through Echo Station 7 with the kind of speed that suggested the Galactic communication network had been upgraded with panic-enhanced transmission protocols. Within hours, the Psychic Dominion's leadership was requesting emergency consultations about the implications of a species that was apparently immune to their primary means of social control. The Mordaki High Council convened an emergency session for the first time in 4 centuries, their crystalline chambers humming with telepathic chatter that ranged from scientific fascination to barely controlled hysteria. The discovery that there was an entire species whose minds were naturally resistant to telepathic interface threatened the very foundation of their carefully constructed social hierarchy. If humans were truly immune to psychic manipulation, then the Dominion's classification system wasn't just flawed, it was potentially reversed. The species they'd dismissed as primitive might actually represent the most advanced form of consciousness in the galaxy, at least from a defensive standpoint. Meanwhile, News of the incident was spreading to other species throughout Dominion space, triggering reactions that ranged from academic curiosity to barely concealed opportunism. The Cathari Consortium immediately began calculating the market value of beings who were naturally immune to telepathic influence. The Vorthak Empire started drafting recruitment proposals for humans as natural counterintelligence agents. The Academic Institute of Comparative Consciousness began preparing research proposals that could keep them busy for the next several centuries. Tobias, meanwhile, was trying to process the revelation that his lifelong inability to quiet his mind was apparently the most sophisticated defense mechanism in the known galaxy. "So let me understand this correctly," he said to Dr. Kelmoth during one of their many consultation sessions. "My species has been classified as telepathically primitive because our minds are too chaotic for your people to read." "Not chaotic," the xenopsychologist corrected, his tentacles rippling with what might have been professional embarrassment. "Defensively organized. Your consciousness has evolved along lines that prioritize mental independence over telepathic compatibility. It's actually quite remarkable once you understand the underlying evolutionary pressures." "But it doesn't feel remarkable," Tobias protested. "It feels like having a committee meeting in my head all the time, with everyone talking over each other and nobody taking proper minutes." Dr. Kelmoth's neural patterns shifted into what he probably thought was a reassuring configuration. "That's because you're comparing your mental state to what you think consciousness should be like, based on fictional representations and philosophical assumptions. But your committee meeting isn't dysfunction. It's the most sophisticated anti-telepathy defense system we've ever encountered." The doctor activated another holographic display, this one showing comparative neural architecture across multiple species. "Consider the difference in approach. Most species evolved consciousness that maximizes mental clarity and telepathic compatibility. Beautiful, organized, and extremely vulnerable to psychic manipulation. Your species evolved consciousness that prioritizes mental independence above all else. The result is minds that are essentially impossible to control or influence telepathically." It was a revelation that forced not just Tobias, but the entire galactic community to reconsider some fundamental assumptions about intelligence, evolution, and the nature of consciousness itself. The economic implications alone were staggering. A species that was naturally immune to the galaxy's most widespread form of mental manipulation suddenly became incredibly valuable as neutral arbitrators, secure communication channels, and counterintelligence assets. The Terran Colonial Authority, which had been struggling to figure out humanity's place in galactic society, suddenly found itself fielding offers from civilizations that wanted to establish exclusive trade agreements with the only known psychic immune species. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the psychic dominion itself. For 4 millennia, they'd organized galactic society according to telepathic ability, creating a hierarchy that placed mind readers at the top and everyone else in descending order of psychic power. The discovery that there was an entire species whose mental architecture made them naturally immune to telepathic control forced a complete re-evaluation of their social structure. If telepathic power could be neutralized by sufficiently chaotic consciousness, then maybe mental strength wasn't the ultimate measure of evolutionary advancement. Maybe the galaxy's most primitive species had actually developed the most sophisticated approach to cognitive independence. Zyx'andra, meanwhile, had submitted formal requests for reassignment to any posting that didn't involve contact with humans, preferably in a different sector of the galaxy, where she could pretend the entire incident had never happened. Her final classification report on Tobias was a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. Subject presents unique challenges for standard telepathic assessment protocols. Recommend development of alternative classification procedures for this species. What she didn't include in the official report was her private conclusion that humans weren't just immune to telepathy, they were walking proof that evolution had a sense of humor. After 4 millennia of Mordaki superiority based on telepathic dominance, along comes a species whose greatest evolutionary achievement was learning to think in such complete chaos that they accidentally became psychic proof. As for Tobias, he eventually returned to his archaeological work with a new appreciation for the noise in his head. Sure, it might be exhausting and occasionally maddening, but it was also, apparently, the most sophisticated cognitive defense system in the known galaxy. Not bad for a species that had only recently figured out how to leave their own solar system without blowing themselves up in the process. The psychic dominion, meanwhile, was facing the kind of existential crisis that comes from discovering that your entire worldview might be built on faulty assumptions. If consciousness could evolve along completely different lines than they'd assumed, then what other surprises might be waiting out there in the galaxy? The universe, it seemed, had saved its best joke for last, making the galaxy's supposedly most primitive species naturally immune to its most advanced telepathic abilities. And somewhere in the cosmic background radiation, you could almost hear the sound of reality chuckling at the idea that mental chaos might actually be the highest form of evolutionary achievement. After all, what's funnier than watching 4,000 years of psychic superiority get derailed by a species whose greatest talent was thinking in complete, glorious weaponized disorder? Absolutely nothing.